Hello and welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. We are very excited to have you join us today as we are going to be looking at some of the words of Jesus we find in the Gospel of Luke. He's going to say some things that perhaps may ring true to you about some attitudes that we hold in today's world that may not be so healthy or conducive to following Christ. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we hope the Lord blesses you through this message. I don't know about you, but there are two attitudes in particular, I think, that are prevalent in today's world. And not only are they prevalent in today's world, I think they are particularly prevalent within the Christian community. And I think it would be wonderful if we would do something about this. These are things that we probably shouldn't do, but yet it seems as if we can't get away from them sometimes. And those two attitudes are this. One, it's an attitude that says, it's me first. And second, there's an attitude that says, it's just us. I think both of these things are unhealthy, but I think we see them relatively often within our Christian community. I remember receiving a phone call when I was back in college, and that year I had been running for student office. And I was excited to run, and in the student association in college, I thought I would have a great experience serving, and so I'd run, and I'd been lucky enough to run unopposed, which was unusual. And when I got this phone call, I heard one of the current officers at that time say hello to me and then congratulate me on the fact that I had indeed won my election. So naturally, I was excited about that. And then I thought, well, there are a few other offices, there are a few other people that are running for office. And so obviously, I was curious to hear and to see who had won and who had lost. So I asked about everybody, and then I asked about one person in one office in particular. And the person on the other end of the line said to me, well, that individual has lost. And I sat there for a minute, kind of surprised, honestly. See, I had watched the campaigns of the other people who were running for office as things were going, and I had kind of expected this person to win. Well, I hung up the phone and I sat there and I thought about it for a few minutes and I thought, man, I thought this person was going to win. How? Why did they lose? Well, I thought about what had gone on over the previous few weeks and how the campaign trail had kind of played out. And there had been different moments where all the candidates had been up there and talked about certain different things. And I'd been there, of course, because I was running. And this person had also. Well, as I thought about it, I thought, well, I guess this person kind of displayed this attitude that maybe had not helped their campaign so much. You see, they'd kind of belittled their opponent. They'd kind of acted in certain ways as if they had already won, and they'd kind of taken for granted the fact that the elections were coming. They thought they would win. They thought it wouldn't be a problem, It was kind of this attitude that displayed, it's me first. And it's not a healthy attitude, and I thought about it in those moments there, and I thought, wow. I guess it kind of turned from it's me first to, well, I just lost. And even though this person may have even done a great job, maybe even a better job than the person that ultimately won, the attitude had really kind of killed it for them. I think the student body, those who were voting, saw this person as someone that they didn't like, and they thought, well, we don't want someone with that type of attitude to hold an office. That's not what we want here. And so that's the first thing that we're going to encounter in our text today, this attitude that says, it's me first. But secondly, we have this attitude that says, it's just us. It's not identical, but it's similar in many ways. To say it's just us, share some characteristics by saying it's me first. When I was a kid growing up, my younger sister and I got along fairly well. We used to love to play together and, go to the beach, go swimming, hang out at home, do all these different things. But I was 3 years older than her. I am 3 years older than her. And there were certain moments, certain times when I liked to be with my friends and do my thing and just do our own thing without my little sister. But, we got to the age where I got to be 16, 17 years old, and I got a driver's license and began to drive. And naturally, as you can imagine, my parents at certain points insisted that, well, you can drive, and they didn't want to drive, so take your sister with you and do these things together, and so on and so forth. Well, I really didn't like that because I liked being with my friends, and I didn't want to have this intrusion, I suppose, of my sister. And I think I really displayed this attitude that said, it's just us. I want to be with me and my friends to do our thing and hang out. And I didn't want her around to ruin what was going on. And I think that's the other attitude that Jesus talks about in the text that we're going to look at today. He talks about this attitude that displays it's just us, this kind of exclusivity that won't allow other people to take part. So, I don't know about you, but I have certainly encountered those types of situations in my life. Maybe at home, maybe in the office, maybe at school, a personal life, professional life, somewhere. There are people somewhere that display that attitude. You see little children on the playground, and everyone's, it's me first, it's me first. Maybe they're trying to get ice cream at the ice cream shop, and every kid wants the ice cream first. Or maybe you're familiar with a situation where you like to travel, and you get to the gate where the plane is about to board, and it seems like everyone wants on that airplane first. Or perhaps you encounter that type of attitude elsewhere. Perhaps people that have gone to Ivy League schools or work for Fortune 500 companies kind of have this, it's just us attitude. So those are the things we're going to encounter today. And if you've encountered those, or even if you've displayed that type of attitude before, Jesus has something to say. I would like to invite you to open with me. We're going to open to the Gospel of Luke, and we're going to look at something Jesus says near the end of the 9th chapter. But before we read there, I'm going to take a look at the context, at what we see here leading up to this moment. So in Luke chapter 9, we have a number of things going on. At the beginning of the chapter, Jesus sends out the 12 to do some work. And then after that, Jesus feeds the 5,000. And that must be important because it's the only miracle that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. Then after he feeds the 5,000, Peter declares that he is the Messiah. So I believe the disciples, or Peter at least, are beginning to see Jesus for who he really is in the fact that he is the Messiah. And after that is done, Jesus predicts his death a second time. And then he says to them, some of you who are here today will not die before you see the glory of God. Well, following that, he takes Peter, John, and James up to the Mount of Transfiguration, where they see him in all of his heavenly glory, standing with Elijah and with Moses. Then he heals a demon-possessed boy. He predicts his death again in that chapter. And finally, we get to the text we are going to read today. So you can think about all those things I've just said, and you can imagine the kind of headspace maybe that the disciples are in. There's a lot going on. There are many things going on around them, and it can probably be a little bit, disorienting. All these things. Jesus has predicted his death twice here. You've got to wonder, what are the disciples thinking in these moments? Well, we're going to read this text. And remember those 2 attitudes we've talked about. It's just me, or it's me first, and it's just us. So, let's read. We're going to read Luke chapter 9, verse 46. Just to kind of set the stage here, the verse says, an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Now, I think that's just kind of a way of saying the disciples were arguing and they were all saying, it's me first. Me first, me first, me first. That's kind of what the disciples are arguing about here in the text. An argument broke out amongst them as to who was the greatest. The truth is, I think saying who's the greatest is just kind of that disguised version of saying, it's me first. And this isn't the only example we find in Scripture of the disciples arguing about stuff like this. I mean, elsewhere in the Gospels, we see James and John, and they get their mother to ask Jesus if James and John can sit at his left and at his right in the kingdom when Jesus comes. This isn't a new thing. The disciples argue at times as far as who should be first. It reminds me of a video I ran across on the internet a few years ago. And it's a video of the Portuguese soccer superstar, Cristiano Ronaldo. And this video came out when he was still playing in Madrid. And as you see the video, you see him just walking around in the streets. But the catch is that he's disguised. He's had a wig put on him, some facial hair glued on. He's in makeup, so you can't tell who he is. And he's walking around there in the streets of Madrid, and he's got a soccer ball, and he's kicking it around with this kid. And you watch the video as Ronaldo and this kid kind of kick the ball around, and no one pays them any mind. People are walking by on the left and on the right, and no one's really paying attention. Perhaps they get a glance here and there, but that's about it. Well, after a few minutes of doing this, Ronaldo finally takes off the disguise. He removes the wig, the fake hair, and then people can see him for who he really is. And it is unbelievable. A crowd appears to materialize out of nowhere. Everyone wants an autograph, a photo. They want to talk to him. It's me first, me first, me first. Let me talk to you. Let me get this picture. Sign this thing for me. It's this attitude of it's me first. And that's kind of the attitude that the disciples are displaying here in this moment. It's me first. But then we move on. We move to the next part of the verse, and Jesus is going to say something interesting. So let's continue reading. We're going to read verses now 47 and 48. And it says this: Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. Then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is the least among you all who is the greatest." So Jesus understands here what they're arguing about. Now, he does something interesting, something that they would have understood in their context, and he brings a little child to them. Now, children back then in first century Israel are very different than children today. So if someone has a child today, a baby, and they bring them out at potluck or a party or something, everyone oohs and ahs. If they're little kids, everyone says, you go first in line for potluck, you get your food first and eat. And the culture today is such that we celebrate kids, we celebrate children, and that's just the way things are. Back then, during the time of Jesus, that was not the case. Back then, children were supposed to be seen but not heard. Children were last. Children were not thought of as very important until they were old enough to actually contribute to society in some way or another. And so children really matter very little to them. So what Jesus does is he takes that little child and he brings that child there in front of the disciples and says, "Listen, in order for you to be part of the kingdom of heaven, you are going to have to become like this child." So what Jesus is saying to them is, in order for you to become part of the kingdom of heaven, you are going to have to become last. You can no longer stand here and say, "Me first, me first, me first." Instead, you're going to have to allow others to go first, and you're going to have to be last. And so that's what Jesus is saying to the disciples here in this context. It reminds me of a story I ran across on the internet a while back. And as the story goes, it was told by Devon Huss, and he tells a story written by Robert Roberts. And it says this: Roberts writes about a fourth grade class in which the teacher introduced a game called Balloon Stomp. A balloon was tied to every child's leg, and the object of the game was to pop everyone else's balloon while protecting one's own. The last person with an intact balloon, of course, would win. Well, the fourth graders in Robert's story entered into the spirit of game with vigor. Balloons were relentlessly targeted and destroyed. A few of the children clung to the sidelines like wallflowers at a middle school dance, but their balloons were doomed just the same. The entire battle was over in a matter of seconds, leaving only one balloon inflated. Its owner was, of course, the most disliked kid in the class. It's hard to really win at a game like Balloon Stomp. In order to complete your mission, you have to be pushy, rude, and offensive. Roberts goes on to write that a second class was introduced to the same game. Only this time it was a class of mentally handicapped children. They were given the same explanation as the first class, and the signal to begin was given, but the game proceeded very differently. Perhaps the instructions were given too quickly for the children with learning disabilities to grasp them. The one idea that got through, however, was that the balloons were supposed to be popped. So it was the balloons, not the other players, that were viewed as enemies. Instead of fighting each other, they began helping each other pop balloons. One little girl knelt down and held her balloon carefully in place, like a holder for a field goal kicker. A little boy stomped it flat. Then he knelt down and held his balloon for her. It went on like this for several minutes until all the balloons were vanquished and everybody cheered. Everybody won. You see, instead of this attitude that says, it's me first, Jesus invites us to allow others to be first. He invites us to be humble. He invites us to be generous. And he invites us to sit there and allow others perhaps to take the cake for once, instead of displaying this attitude of saying, it's me first, it's me first, it's me first. And so when Jesus has that little child there in front of him, he's saying, listen, you have to be more like this kid in this society that is downtrodden, marginalized. No one thinks of this kid as going first. Everyone thinks of this kid as going last. So that's the attitude, Jesus says, that I want you to display, because that's the attitude that will get you into the kingdom of heaven. But now we move on. He's talked about it's me first, but then we move on to it's just us. So we're going to go back and read once more verses 49 and 50 and see what Jesus says here. The text says this: Master, said John, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he is not one of us. Do not stop him, Jesus said, for whoever is not against you is for you. It's kind of a strange little anecdote right there. Someone else is trying to drive out demons in the name of Jesus, and the disciples that is, try to stop that person. And Jesus says, don't stop that person. And I think what he's kind of saying here is, listen, don't display the attitude of it's just us. Just because you're my disciples, just because you've been called to follow me, doesn't mean you are the only ones who have been called to follow me, Jesus says. There are others. You are not alone. There are many, in fact, Jesus says, who will follow me through the years, the decades, the centuries, and the millennia. And do not get it twisted. Don't think that you are the only ones, because I have called many. And just because they don't share the exact same beliefs or ideas as you do, doesn't mean they aren't followers of mine, Jesus says. So, he kind of sympathizes with the disciples here a little bit, but he says, listen, you can't be the people who say it's just us. And this isn't the only example in Scripture where they're like that. I think we see examples like that in Scripture all over the place. I mean, you see back in the Old Testament when Elijah goes up to Mount Sinai and he complains to God and says, I am the only one who's been faithful to you. And God says, listen, I have thousands more in Israel who have yet to bend the knee to Baal. It is not just you. We see examples of this all over the place. And Jesus is very, very specific about exclusivity. He does not want his disciples, his followers, he doesn't want us to display this attitude that says, it's just us. You cannot be a part of this. Because that is not the Jesus way. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not here to say that Adventism is wrong or that Christianity isn't the way to go, because I am deeply convicted of my faith and my beliefs. But what I do believe that Jesus is saying is, listen, just because you are right, or just because you believe this thing and other people don't, doesn't make you my only followers. There are many, many everywhere who follow me. And I think we can get kind of tied to this idea of exclusivity because we like people who are just like us. We like people who think like us, who act like us, who look like us. But the truth is, the kingdom of heaven one day will be filled with people for whom that is not true. I'm sure there will be plenty of people in heaven who don't think like us, or don't act like us, or don't look like us. And that is okay, because that's what being part of the kingdom of heaven is about. It reminds me of a story that I've heard told before, that originates with the well-known preacher, Tony Campolo. And as the story goes, Peter is at the pearly gates of heaven, and as he stands there, there's a long line of people waiting to get in. And he stands there with a list. He's checking people off the list as they come to the gate. He finds their name and says, yes, you are in. You belong in heaven. And person after person comes up to the gate, and Peter finds their name and checks them off. But every once in a while, Peter runs into somebody who does not belong. And as he searches their name and doesn't find it, he says, listen, I'm sorry, but you don't belong in heaven, and turns them away. Well, as Peter goes about his day, and his day finishes, he goes back into heaven, and he begins to notice something a little strange, I suppose. And he begins to notice what he thinks are people who he has turned away at the gate. And at first he was like, oh, I'm just seeing things that aren't really there. But as time goes on, he really begins to think that he's noticing people that don't belong. Well, he's trying to solve this problem, so he goes to Paul and he says, listen, Paul, I need some help. I think there are people getting into heaven who don't belong here, who aren't saved. I've been turning them away at the gate, but somehow I think these people are getting in. So naturally, Paul says, okay, I'll help you figure it out. So Peter goes back to his job, day in, day out, checking people on that list and off that list. Welcome to heaven, you belong. Welcome to heaven, you belong. Welcome to heaven, you belong. And every once in a while saying, listen, I'm sorry, but you're not on the list. It's time for you to go. And so Paul keeps an eye out, and he begins to notice the same thing. He says to Peter, listen, I'm noticing the same thing. There are people who you are turning away at the gates who somehow, some way, are still getting in. So they begin to look a little more carefully. They begin to check and try to see what's going on here. And finally, one day, it happens. Paul comes running to Peter, who stands there at the pearly gates, and says, Peter, I figured it out. And Peter says, well, what's going on? You won't believe what's happening, says Paul. Well, what is it? Says Peter with bated anticipation. And Paul finally gets it out. He says, you know what it is? It's Jesus. Jesus keeps sneaking those people over the back wall. It's Jesus? Yes, it's Jesus. And the truth is, it is Jesus. It's always been Jesus. He's the one who is always bringing more people into the fold, whether or not they belong. Because that's who Jesus is. He's a person, he's a God who will not allow us to stand here and say, it's just us. That type of exclusivity is not healthy. It's not the type of thing that Jesus would want. He wants everyone to come and be a part of the kingdom of heaven, because that's the type of God that he is. He's the one who will sneak you and will sneak me over the back wall one day. Now, I think at the end of the day, when we look here at this text, Luke is saying some important things. We've come to this text with this attitude, perhaps, that says, one, it's me first, or two, It's just us. Once again, this is an attitude that we perhaps run into on a daily or weekly basis in our own individual lives. We see other people elsewhere saying, it's me first, it's me first. Or groups of people here and there saying, it's just us, it's just us. But I want you to think. I want you to think about that, because although I'm sure you and I see other people doing that, it's likely true that you and I do that as well. Where in your life does that happen? Where do you stand there and say, it's me first? Maybe you're in line at the grocery store, and it's you and one other person vying to get in front. Maybe it would be a good idea for you to every once in a while just say, oh, it's all right. You go ahead. Or you and one other person are neck and neck in your cars, and there is one spot there that is right at the front of the red light. And you kind of put your foot down on that accelerator and try to pass somebody else. But maybe this time, it would be better to say, oh, it's all right. You know, kind of ease off that accelerator a bit and let someone else go first for once. Maybe it's time to not say, it's me first. Or perhaps it's something else. Maybe you work somewhere. And maybe you have all these coworkers who you've become good friends with, and then somebody new gets hired. And it's kind of easy to just sit there and not include that person. After all, none of you know that person. They're new, they'll figure it out. After all, you had to figure it out when you got here so many years ago. But maybe it's time not to say it's just us, but to welcome somebody else into the fold. Or maybe you encounter that situation elsewhere, at school, at work, at home. You like the way things are. You don't want to be made uncomfortable by the addition of somebody new. You like it when it's just us. Well, here in this text, Jesus is calling us to be different. He's calling us to allow others to go first. He's saying, in order to be part of the exclusive here in heaven, you're going to have to start being inclusive here. You're going to have to allow people in that you may not want to. You're going to have to allow other people to go first. So as you go forth in your daily life, and you run into these situations, as you doubtless will somewhere, perhaps think about that. Thank you so much for joining us on Creating Disciples today. We hope you had a blessed and wonderful experience.